Back in 2011, I went to a summer camp called Camp Hillridge that my parents had signed me up for. Luckily, my best friend Kyle was going too, so I wasn't stuck going without knowing anyone. The camp lasted 2 weeks and had that classic look you'd expect from old-school summer camp movies. There were 2 main cabins where the boys and girls slept, a large lodge that worked as the dining area and activity center, and a bunch of smaller buildings scattered around the campgrounds. Kyle and I would stay up later than the other campers because we wanted to play games on our Nintendo DS systems together. It was already past 2 a.m., deep into the night, and we were still playing when the door to our cabin creaked open. Panicking, we both quickly shoved our DSs under our pillows and acted like we were asleep. Footsteps moved through the room, passing from Kyle's bed over to mine. Then the steps stopped right by my bed, and for a brief second, I could feel the faint sensation of someone's breath on the back of my neck. After a moment, the footsteps moved away and headed back toward the door. Just before the door closed, I looked over at Kyle and whispered, "That was creepy," especially since whoever it was had been so close, breathing down my neck. We nervously went back to playing our games, keeping the screen brightness turned all the way down. That's when I got a text on my phone. The message said, "Why are you two still up?" The kids with phones had been given a list of counselor numbers to call in case of emergency, but this number wasn't one I recognized from the list. I texted back, asking, "Who is this?" But I never got a reply. I told Kyle, who didn't have a phone, and he was just as rattled as I was. We figured it had to be a counselor messing with us. Or at least we hoped. So we kept playing on our DSs, keeping as quiet as possible. That's when we both heard the back door of the cabin slowly open. We exchanged worried looks and once again hid our DSs under the pillows. But this time, there were no footsteps. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. It read, "It's Counselor Tony. Come out back. I need to talk to you." I told Kyle, and right away he said it sounded way too weird. We started wondering if maybe this Tony person was the one who had just slipped in through the back. I got up from my bed and cautiously walked toward the center of the room where I could see down the hallway toward the back door. There was nobody in sight, so I walked a little closer. Kyle was whispering for me to stop. As I got near the back screen door, I noticed a small section of wall that jutted in, creating a little hidden corner. And tucked into that corner was someone crouched down, half hidden. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a counselor at all. It was an older man, probably in his 50s, who looked dirty and rough and was around my height. I bolted back to my bed, screaming for help, which woke up everyone in the cabin. At that moment, I heard the back door slam shut. A counselor rushed in through the front door, and I told them everything that had just happened. The counselors searched all over the campgrounds, checking the woods and the whole area, but the place was surrounded by thick forest. Finding anyone would have been nearly impossible. What still confuses me to this day is how that man even got my number. My only guess is that he somehow got a hold of the list of camper numbers the counselors had made. But how did he know which number was mine? I still have the occasional nightmare about that night. I was just 14, and that was both my first and last summer at camp. Some of the more outgoing kids at camp started talking to me pretty early on. I honestly can't remember the kid's name, so I'll just call him Jake. Jake was a short blonde kid who always wore a Red Sox cap. At the time, I thought he was the coolest kid ever, but looking back now, I realize he was probably one of those kids who became a troublemaker in high school. On the first day, while we were getting a tour of the campgrounds, Jake and I noticed an old, beat-up cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. We asked one of the counselors about it, but he said he didn't know. It was his first week working there. All he could tell us was that no one had been in that cabin for a long time. On the last night of camp, we were in our bunks getting ready for bed when Jake came over and whispered in my ear. He wanted to sneak over to that old cabin, just for the thrill of it, to see what was inside. I wanted Jake to think I was cool, since for whatever reason I looked up to him, so I agreed. Once everyone was asleep, we snuck outside and crept toward the old cabin. We waited until the lights went out in the counselors' cabins, which didn't take long since it was already pretty late. And then we ran down the path past the counselors' places toward the abandoned cabin. My heart was pounding the whole time. I wasn't really the kind of kid to do stuff like this, not at that age anyway. Jake led the way until we were standing by the cabin door. The front door was boarded shut, which was part of why we were so curious about it in the first place. Luckily for us, or maybe unluckily, one of the windows was already broken wide open. We climbed inside. These cabins were pretty big, not tiny little huts like you might be imagining. Each one could fit around 10 campers. This one was no different. Jake and I stood there in the dark, cold room with our hands stretched out to make sure we didn't bump into anything. I kept walking into bunk beds, and I could hear Jake doing the same. I stopped for a second to listen to what Jake was up to, and I heard bouncing on one of the beds. "Cut it out," I told him, thinking he was jumping up and down on one of the old mattresses. But then Jake's voice came from the far side of the room. As best as I remember, he said, "That's not me. I thought that was you." We had no flashlight or anything to help us see, so we were stuck in a pitch-black room in a building no one had used for years, and all we could hear was the sound of someone bouncing on a squeaky bed. Of course, we freaked out. We bolted for the window we'd come through. It was small, though, so it took a bit to climb out. As I waited for Jake to get through, the bouncing noise suddenly stopped, and then came a loud thud, like someone had jumped off the bed. I scrambled to the window, and as I was pulling myself through, I felt two hands grab my foot and try to yank me back inside. But I was already halfway out. We both took off running back to our cabin and locked the door behind us. We thought about going to the head counselor's cabin to tell someone, but we figured we'd just get in trouble, so we didn't. Looking back, yeah, that was a dumb choice. But we made it through the night and went home the next day with one wild story to tell. It was a summer at a youth camp meant for kids between 12 and 15. The place had a bit of a past. Years ago, an elderly woman who used to work there had passed away, though the cause was never shared publicly. She had been one of the cooks, Mrs. Harlan. I'll keep this brief. It was one of those nights when my mind just wouldn't let me sleep. I kept tossing and turning on a stiff old cot while everyone else in the cabin was out cold. The moon was full, making the night unusually bright. Pale beams streamed through every window. I was so wide awake that I just gave up on trying to sleep. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked up again, I noticed something odd. The moonlight coming through the window across from me was partly blocked. My heart jumped when I saw what was blocking it. It was a person's head. It looked like an older woman, and she had a faded red hat on. What in the world is this woman doing here? I wondered. It didn't really hit me until I realized she was staring straight at me. Her eyes were locked onto mine. Panic kicked in. I turned to my side and squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. Or maybe I just wanted to hide under the blanket like a little kid. I waited about a minute before I dared peek back. She was gone. I let out a shaky breath. But now the room felt darker, like something was off. I glanced up at the window right above my cot, not even 3 feet away, and there she was again. The same old woman with the red hat, peering down at me. I yanked the blanket over my head and curled up, trembling. I have no idea how long I stayed like that before I finally drifted off. The next thing I remember is going to one of the camp leaders the next morning to tell him about the woman in the red hat. He glanced over at the two women sitting in his office, and they exchanged uneasy looks. One of them said quietly, "That's so strange. That sounds just like Mrs. Harlan." My stomach dropped when I heard that. Even now, I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was a real person, something my tired brain imagined, or maybe, just maybe, it really was Mrs. Harlan out there. I'll never forget that summer I spent at a sleepaway camp in Vermont. I was just a kid back then and pretty shy. Meeting the other campers during the first day's welcome session was nerve-wracking for me. I would have much rather been home playing my Sega. A lot of the other kids made friends fast. I was sure I wouldn't fit in, but luckily some really